Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you're new here, consider subscribing, because this is where we explore true horror stories. Dark, haunting, and sometimes more terrifying than anything the imagination could ever create. And if you've been here before, I'm glad to welcome you back for another story. The Appalachian Mountains have held on to countless stories that survive today only in old journals, unsent letters, and files misplaced in drawers no one opened for decades. Most of them tell of ordinary things: a family leaving a valley before winter, a hunter failing to return when expected, a house abandoned after an outbreak of disease, or a road that appeared on one map and vanished during the next survey. But every so often, buried among those modest records, there is a story that refuses to remain in the past. It seems to change each time it is read, not because the words on the page are different, but because the reader begins to notice details that had somehow gone unseen before. The Alder Run expedition of 1857 was one such case. 7 men left the small town of Bellwether in western Virginia near the end of summer. They traveled toward the mountains bordering what is now southern West Virginia, at a time when that land was still part of the Commonwealth of Virginia. According to the official record, their purpose was to survey water sources, measure elevations, mark routes that might be developed into transport roads, and examine several exposed rock seams that landowners in the east believed might contain coal or iron ore. They carried surveying instruments, measuring chains, pack mules, provisions for several weeks, and 3 clearly numbered leather-bound field books. 5 men returned. The other 2 were never found, although the survivors insisted they had searched for days. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no personal belongings left behind along the route. More disturbing still, when the party returned to Bellwether, they were carrying 4 journals instead of 3. The 4th was nearly the same size as the others, with a gray leather cover, aged page edges, and no owner's name. None of the 5 survivors admitted to bringing it when they set out. None could explain when it had entered their baggage. Inside that journal were maps that matched no known landscape, columns of numbers that followed no conventional system of measurement, and passages written in a script whose origin later scholars could not identify. Some pages accurately recorded places the expedition had crossed. Others described locations the 5 survivors swore they had never visited. Most troubling of all, the final 12 pages bore dates that came after the party had already returned. For years, those pages were dismissed as clerical errors, a hoax, or the work of someone whose mind had broken under prolonged isolation. But the handwriting on those final entries matched none of the men. The ink was not the kind they had carried, and when the journal was examined again decades later, 2 additional pages were discovered between sheets that had already been numbered, as though the pages had always been there and no one had ever seen them. To understand why these documents still provoke debate, we have to return to Bellwether in 1857, when the town stood at the edge of what people in the eastern part of the state considered settled country. Bellwether was not the poorest place in the region, but it was small enough that everyone noticed when a stranger arrived, and distant enough from the major cities that news often reached it weeks late. A dirt road ran past a row of low buildings, connecting the general store, the blacksmith shop, the post office, and a 2-story inn. West of town, the road narrowed quickly, passing scattered farms before dividing into trails used by hunters, loggers, and mountain families. Beyond those trails were areas shown on maps only by broken lines, dotted markings, or empty space. The expedition was led by Samuel Vane. He was 46 years old, an experienced land surveyor who had helped establish county boundaries in Virginia and Kentucky. The surviving records describe Vane as a reserved man who disliked exaggeration and routinely checked a figure twice before allowing it onto a map. The second member was Jonah Mercer, a 38-year-old botanist sent by a college in Richmond to collect plant specimens and document changes in vegetation at different elevations. Thomas Keel served as cartographer and keeper of the 3 leather field books. Amos Bell was an ore assayer responsible for examining rock samples. Peter Dobb handled the pack mules and maintained the equipment. The 2 youngest members were cousins Nathan Rusk and Eli Rusk, both of whom had previously cut roads for logging crews. The 7 men had different skills, but none was a complete stranger to the mountains. Later accounts emphasized this point because it weakened the idea that the expedition failed through simple inexperience. Vane understood terrain. Mercer knew how to read changes in plant growth and water flow. Keel could reconstruct a route from basic measurements. Amos Bell could distinguish natural rock formations from signs of human excavation. Peter Dobb knew how to recognize old trails. The Rusk cousins were strong enough to cut a path through the densest timber. They prepared for nearly 2 months. The surviving inventory shows considerable care. Cornmeal, salted meat, dried beans, coffee, salt, wool blankets, oilcloth tents, fever medicine, sewing needles, rope, spare axe heads, oil lamps, compasses, an angle measuring instrument, a sighting scope, and 2 coils of survey chain. One chain was marked at intervals for measuring distance. The other was a spare. That spare chain later became an important part of the case because, when the 5 men returned, it was found twisted into a shape no one could undo without cutting through individual links. Their planned route followed the north side of the Clinch River for several days before turning toward a group of small valleys between 2 mountain ranges that had never been fully surveyed. The farthest point of the journey was an area locals called Alder Run, named for a narrow stream bordered by alder trees. The name appeared in a few old land records, but its location was inconsistent. One document placed Alder Run near a southern tributary. Another put it almost 30 miles farther west. Vane intended to locate the stream, establish its true position, and use it as a reference point for the surrounding country. During the days they spent in Bellwether before leaving, the men spoke with many local residents. Most offered practical information about the first stretches of road, places where provisions could be purchased, and low areas prone to flooding. Only one unusual detail was mentioned in later testimony. An elderly woman who lived near the post office saw Thomas Keel's 3 journals and told the men they should take a 4th book to record the road home. No one treated the remark as a warning. Keel answered that 3 books would be enough, while Vane assumed she merely meant the journey might last longer than expected. Years later, after the 4th journal became the center of the investigation, people tried to identify the woman. No clear record of her was found. Some residents remembered her as having lived in Bellwether. Others said she had only rented a room there for a few weeks. Descriptions of her appearance did not agree. The only detail several witnesses remembered the same way was that she never asked where the expedition was going. She looked at the journals and spoke only of the road back, as though returning would be the most difficult part of the journey. The party left Bellwether on a morning near the end of August. The weather was dry, the sky was clear, and the first trails were broad enough for the pack mules. During the first week, almost everything went according to plan. Vane measured elevations, Keel kept the record, Mercer collected plants, and Amos Bell examined exposed rock along the slopes. They met 2 families living in small valleys and traded coffee for corn. A hunter traveled with them for half a day, showed them a pass over one ridge, and then turned back. The opening pages of the 3 journals were entirely ordinary. They contained figures, directions, descriptions of water sources, hours traveled, and the condition of their supplies. Keel even recorded minor matters, a mule scraping its leg, a broken strap buckle, and Mercer drying specimens too close to the fire and damaging several leaves. Nothing suggested that the men were entering a story that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The first change came on the 9th day, when they found a stone marker beside a road that did not appear on any map. The marker stood as high as a man's chest. It had been assembled from thin slabs and set on a patch of level ground. It resembled neither a county boundary stone nor a trail sign left by hunters. 7 vertical grooves had been cut into its eastern face, each one equally deep. Beneath them was a curved shape like a shallow basin, with 3 circular marks below it. Amos Bell examined the stone and found that the slabs had come from different places. Some were limestone, others sandstone, and one narrow piece appeared to be a dark, iron-rich rock. There was no practical reason for anyone to carry all those different stones to one location merely to build a marker. Vane thought it might have been left by an earlier survey party. Keel copied the symbol into his notes. Mercer observed that no saplings grew around the marker, even though the soil was moist and the clearing received adequate light. The Rusk cousins did not want to remain there. According to later testimony, Nathan said he had seen a similar marker as a child in a valley several days' travel away. When pressed for details, however, he could not remember where it had been or who had been with him. The party continued. They did not yet know that the pattern of 7 grooves, the basin shape, and the 3 dots would appear again and again. It would be found in the 4th journal, in the locked survey chain, in drawings of terrain that did not exist, and eventually on the gravestone of a person who had never taken part in the expedition. For the next 3 days, the road remained clear enough for the men to believe it had once been used regularly. Old wheel ruts appeared in several stretches of soft earth, but the distance between them was narrower than that of an ordinary wagon. Peter Dobbs suggested they might have been left by a small timber cart. The trees on both sides of the road, however, were fully mature. Many were thick enough to have been standing before any cart could have passed between them. This was not impossible to explain. The road might once have been wider and later reclaimed by the forest. Yet the wheel marks continued through places where there was not enough clearance for an axle. Vane checked their bearing every morning and afternoon. By the 12th day, the compasses began giving inconsistent results. The needles did not spin wildly. Instead, each one drifted slightly toward the southwest by roughly the same amount, no matter where they stood. Amos Bell suspected iron deposits nearby. Mercer found several pieces of black rock in the stream bed and agreed that the explanation was reasonable. Vane recorded the deviation and continued navigating by the sun and the shape of the terrain. That small error later became one of his greatest regrets. In private notes written after the expedition, Vane said the men had accepted a plausible explanation too quickly. Not because the theory about iron ore was necessarily wrong, but because it caused them to stop asking questions. In his view, an expedition was rarely pushed off course by one great decision. More often, it happened through a series of small decisions, each reasonable on its own, which together created a route no one had deliberately chosen. On the 13th day, the weather changed. Low clouds covered the ridges, making it nearly impossible to navigate by the sun. Prolonged rain raised the creeks quickly and turned the slopes slick. The party left the old road in search of higher ground. Vane intended to make only a one-day detour and then return. But when the weather cleared, they could no longer find the road. Losing a trail in the Appalachians was not unusual. Rain could erase tracks, fallen branches could hide a path, and a person who drifted only a few hundred yards in dense forest might find himself looking at entirely different country. Vane and the two Rusk cousins searched for nearly half a day. They found 3 trails that appeared to have been used, but none matched their original direction. In the end, the group chose the path descending south because it led toward a small stream. They believed that if they followed the water long enough, it would join a tributary they could identify on the map. That stream became the second problem. It was only a few paces wide, running between low stone banks and exposed roots. But when Keel checked the bearing, he found that the water flowed northeast while the valley's general slope fell toward the southwest. They tested it several times. The ground was not uneven enough to create an illusion. The stream seemed to be moving against the direction the terrain required, though the difference in elevation was slight. Vane suggested that a buried rock channel might slope differently from the visible surface. Mercer did not argue, but wrote privately that he had never seen water maintain such a direction over so great a distance. They followed it for 2 days. Instead of opening into a larger valley, the stream wound between slopes that drew steadily closer together. Alder trees became more common, matching the old descriptions of Alder Run, but no one was willing to say they had found the right place. The maps showed Alder Run flowing west into a major tributary. The water before them moved northeast, then abruptly turned south through a narrow bend without any meaningful change in the land. On the evening of the 15th day, Thomas Keel noticed something strange in Field Book number 2. Along the lower edges of the 3 most recent pages were small marks resembling coal smudges. At first, he assumed the dust had come from Amos Bell's sample bag. When he tried to wipe the marks away, they remained. They formed connected curves, not clear enough to call writing, yet too deliberate to be random stains. Keel marked the pages, wrapped the book in cloth, and placed it in a separate bag. By the next morning, the marks had spread across nearly half a page. This is one of the details the 5 survivors later described differently. Vane said the markings had already been there, and Keel had simply failed to notice them. Mercer believed they appeared overnight. Peter Dobb remembered Keel becoming angry because someone had written in his book. Amos Bell did not remember the argument at all. Eli Rusk, one of the 2 men who never returned, left no statement. Nathan Rusk survived the expedition but later refused to discuss Field Book number 2. The surviving pages show that the earliest marks were simple. They consisted of curved lines circling an empty point, resembling contour lines that indicated no elevation. Between the curves were clusters of 3 dots. The symbol recalled the design cut into the first stone marker. Keel copied every mark onto a separate sheet so he could track any changes. That sheet later proved the pattern had expanded. His copy from the 16th day covered only a small area, while the original page was almost completely filled by the time the men returned. Even so, the expedition continued. They still had provisions, no one was seriously injured, and Vane believed he could bring them back to the intended route by finding a high ridge from which to observe the country. They left the stream, climbed northward, and spent most of a day crossing a slope covered with loose stone. From a low summit, they saw range after range of mountains but recognized nothing on their maps. A broad valley should have lain to the west, where two rivers came together. Instead, they saw an oval depression enclosed by three ridges that nearly formed a complete ring. Mercer called it a basin. Keel drew its outline. Vane decided to follow the northern rim rather than descend, because no clear exit was visible from below. Before they left the summit, however, Peter Dobb noticed a straight line cutting through the trees on the opposite slope. It was too regular to be natural, held a consistent width, and appeared to cross stands of timber at an unchanging angle. They examined it through the sighting scope, but still could not tell whether it was a road, a wall, or a strip of cleared forest. Vane suggested an abandoned logging grade. Nathan Rusk insisted that he knew the place. He said he had heard his father speak of a stone road through Alder Run, built before the present settlements existed. When asked where it led, Nathan could remember only one phrase: the place where the waters cannot choose a direction. The sentence appears in Field Book number 1 in Vane's handwriting. It also appears in the fourth journal, but there it is written in the undeciphered script. Not until 1923 did a professor who studied ancient writing systems notice that the same cluster of symbols repeated in passages associated with water, roads, and direction. He did not claim to have translated the phrase. He said only that the structure appeared to serve the same function each time it occurred. The men camped on the mountainside that night. The records suggest no one maintained a full watch because everyone was exhausted. The next morning, they discovered that one of the survey chains had been removed from the equipment chest and arranged in a pattern on the ground. None of the links had been opened. The chain formed 3 large interlocking loops with nearly equal spaces of bare earth at their centers. One end lay beneath a small stone, while the other pointed toward the basin below. Peter Dobb thought one of the Rusk cousins might have done it while sleepwalking. Nathan denied it. Eli said nothing. Vane ordered the chain gathered up and recorded the event as an irresponsible prank. But when Dobb tried to coil it, he found that the loops had been passed through one another in a way that could not be undone by pulling either end. That might sound like a complicated knot. The problem was that the chain was one continuous length. There was no open section through which one loop could have been threaded into another. Amos Bell inspected every link and found no place where it had been cut and rejoined. It took them nearly 2 hours to free the chain by lifting sections, turning them, and feeding them through narrow openings. Keel recorded the sequence, but his drawing was later judged inaccurate. When mathematicians attempted to reconstruct it, they concluded that the chain could not have been arranged as shown unless one end had somehow passed through a closed loop. Keel may have drawn it incorrectly. The witnesses may have remembered it wrong. But after that incident, Vane ordered all equipment locked inside the chest every night. At noon on the 17th day, they reached the straight line they had seen from the ridge. It was not a logging road. It was a strip of flat stone nearly 6 feet wide, running through the forest between parallel edges. Trees grew close on both sides, but not on the stone itself. In some places, the surface was buried beneath soil and leaves. Yet when the men cleared them away, they found fitted slabs continuing underneath. There were no wheel tracks, hoof prints, or recent footprints. Amos Bell saw that the slabs were not all the same kind of stone. Some came from the surrounding region. Others contained minerals he could not identify in the field. The construction was also unusual. The stones did not fit tightly together, yet the gaps between them remained exactly the same width. When Keel took measurements, he found that the road ran neither north-south nor east-west. It followed an angle the compass identified differently depending on which edge the observer stood beside. Vane called a halt so they could measure it carefully. This is where the journals begin to contradict one another. Field Book number 1 says they remained there for 3 hours. Number 2 records almost 6. Mercer's journal states that the sun held the same position throughout the measurements, though he crossed out the sentence and replaced it with a note blaming the clouds for distorting his sense of time. Peter Dobb's provision ledger shows that the men ate 2 meals beside the stone road. None of them remembered staying long enough to do so. The party finally decided to follow the road northwest, since that direction brought them closer to their original route. For the first several miles, travel was easier than it had been at any point since leaving Bellwether. The surface was relatively level, there were few fallen trees, and no major grades. Yet the ease of travel made Vane uneasy. The road appeared in no record, passed no reliable water source, and seemed to have required far more labor than the scattered communities of the region would ever have needed. By afternoon, they reached a second stone marker. It was lower than the first, but bore the same 7 grooves, the basin shape, and the 3 dots. On its northern face, an additional horizontal line crossed all 7 grooves. Keel copied the design. Mercer examined the soil around the base and found dry plant fibers braided into narrow strips. He could not identify the species. The fibers looked old but showed no decay. When he held them near the fire that evening, they contracted into a hard gray knot and did not burn like grass or bark. Vane began considering a retreat. The party had been en route for days, the compasses could not be trusted, and someone in the group was clearly interfering with the instruments or the journals. Returning, however, would not be simple. The old trail was gone, the weather remained unstable, and they did not know whether the stone road led closer to inhabited country or farther away. He chose to continue for 2 more days in search of high ground or a major watercourse, after which he would select a route back. That decision is often described as the expedition's greatest mistake, yet the surviving record shows that Vane was not acting recklessly. He was doing what an experienced surveyor would normally do, locating a dependable reference point before changing direction. The problem was that from that moment forward, every reference point around them began to seem placed there for the purpose of leading the party toward one particular destination. On the morning of the 18th day, the stone road continued almost perfectly straight. It crossed slopes through shallow cuts, bridged narrow streams on long slabs, and sometimes disappeared beneath the earth for several hundred paces before reappearing precisely along the same projected line. There were no wooden bridges, mileposts, or remains of settlements. What they saw resembled the foundation of a road built to outlast its makers, though it served no obvious purpose of travel or trade. Mercer noticed changes in the vegetation along both sides. Plants normally found at lower elevations appeared higher on the slope, while cold-loving species grew near the bottoms of ravines. Some alder leaves had already turned yellow, though autumn had barely begun. He collected samples, recorded their locations, and pressed them between sheets of paper. After the expedition, every specimen from that stretch of road faded to a pale gray, lost the structure of its veins, and could no longer be classified. Samples collected earlier remained normal. Near midday, the men came upon a row of low wooden stakes beside the road. Each rose only a little above knee height. The wood was weathered silver, but had not rotted. The spacing was so exact that Keel measured it 3 times. At the top of every stake was a small square opening. Viewed through in sequence, all the openings aligned with a narrow gap between 2 distant peaks. Vane measured the angle and found that the line of sight matched neither sunrise nor sunset at any nearby season of the year. Amos Bell removed a small loose fragment from the base of one stake to identify the wood. Mercer objected to damaging the remains, but the piece had already begun to separate. Inside, there was no lengthwise grain like normal timber. The layers circled the center, more like the structure of bone. Mercer preserved the sample in a glass vial. The vial remained in storage until 1889, when a curator found it empty, even though the cork and wax seal had never been broken. By late afternoon, the road descended into the basin they had observed from the ridge. 3 mountain ranges enclosed it, leaving only a narrow gap to the south. From above, that gap had looked like a natural exit, but the stone road did not lead toward it. Instead, it ran directly into the center, where the forest was too dense for the ground to be seen. Vane ordered camp made at the basin's edge. He wanted to locate water and determine whether they could follow the northern slope out. The Rusk cousins were sent a short distance ahead. They returned before dark and reported a stream below, but neither man remembered placing 3 black stones in his coat pockets. Nathan suggested he might have picked them up to mark the route. Eli insisted he had no idea where they had come from. The stones were nearly identical in size, naturally smooth, and each bore a white line around its middle. Amos Bell tapped one lightly to test its hardness, then stopped when all 3 developed a fresh crack in exactly the same place. The material inside was not black but silver gray. He wrapped them separately, but by morning only 2 remained. The third was found resting on the first page of field book number 2, although Keel had kept the book in a bag beneath his head while he slept. That same night, the 4th journal was mentioned for the first time in the surviving record. Thomas Keel woke before dawn and saw a gray leather notebook lying beside the equipment chest. He assumed one of his 3 books had become damp and carried it toward the lamp to inspect it. The cover bore no number. Its fastening strap was made of something resembling leather but showed no stitching. The opening pages were already filled with writing. Keel woke Vane and the others. No one claimed the book. Later accounts disagree about how the men reacted. Vane said he believed it had belonged to an earlier party and ordered it preserved as an artifact. Peter Dobb remembered Vane wanting to leave it behind while Keel objected. Mercer wrote privately that Nathan Rusk took the journal before anyone else and opened directly to a page showing the basin, as if he already knew where it was. Amos Bell could not remember who opened it first. Eli left no account. The fourth journal did not look like something abandoned for years in a forest. Its cover was dry, the paper had no mildew, and there was no mud along the edges. Its binding, however, appeared older than the mid-19th century. A bookbinder who examined it in 1861 believed the materials and technique might date to the late 18th century, though he could not identify the place of manufacture. The paper contained flax fibers, tree bark, and a mineral component uncommon in writing paper. The ink on the first pages was inconsistent. Some passages had browned like old iron gall ink. Others remained dark as if freshly written. Still others showed a gray sheen when viewed at an angle. The first pages depicted terrain in simple lines. Keel recognized the stone road, the two markers, and the basin enclosed on three sides. The map had no scale and no north arrow, yet the relative positions were astonishingly accurate. At the center of the basin was a small rectangle divided into 7 compartments. 3 curved lines extended from it toward the surrounding ridges. Beneath the rectangle stood a column of symbols arranged in 7 groups. The 6th and 7th groups had been crossed out with a heavy stroke. Later researchers often assumed those marks were added after the Rusk cousins disappeared. But Keel copied the image into Field Book number 3 on the morning the 4th journal was found. His copy was clearly dated and appeared in the uninterrupted sequence of numbered pages. Unless the record was altered after the expedition, the 2 crossed-out groups existed before either man vanished. Vane decided to take the journal with them. It might help identify whoever had used the stone road, and he had no firm reason to treat it as dangerous. He wrapped the book and locked it inside the equipment chest with the instruments. From that moment on, the expedition carried 4 journals. The following morning, the men descended into the basin along a narrower branch of the stone road. The air below was colder than on the outer slopes despite the lower elevation. A thin mist remained beneath the trees until nearly noon. Mercer wrote that distance had become difficult to judge. Trees far away seemed closer when viewed directly, but appeared to recede as he walked toward them. He crossed out the passage and replaced it with a note about humidity reducing visibility. The stream the Rusk cousins had found lay near the center. It was wider than the earlier watercourse, but showed almost no visible grade. The surface moved slowly, and no one could determine which direction it flowed. When Vane dropped in a sliver of wood, it drifted north. Another piece released only a few paces away moved south. Mercer tried leaves. They turned in slow circles and then stopped in the middle of the current. It might have been a pool fed by small opposing currents, but the channel extended in both directions and had 2 distinct ends. Vane followed it for nearly a mile, trying to determine its flow. At both ends, the water appeared to move inward toward the center of the basin. No one found a source, and no one found an outlet. Along the bank stood many small cairns, each made of 7 stones. Several had fallen, but the original number could still be counted. Keel realized their positions formed the same curve shown in the 4th journal. From the outermost cairn, a line drawn through the others pointed toward the eastern woods, where a rectangular patch of darkness lay between the trees. The men approached it and found a low stone structure. It was larger than a tent, but had no roof in the ordinary sense. Slabs from both sides leaned inward, forming a long, narrow chamber. The entrance faced west, and was just large enough for a man to pass through while stooping. There was no door. On the slab above the opening was the symbol of 7 grooves, the basin, and 3 dots, cut more deeply than before. 2 horizontal lines crossed the 6th and 7th grooves. Vane ordered everyone to remain outside until the exterior had been examined. Amos Bell determined that the slabs were heavy enough to have required several men and proper equipment to raise. Some surfaces bore tool marks, but not the kind left by hammer or chisel. The edges were rounded rather than sharp, as if the stone had been worn smooth and fitted together while softer than it was now. Mercer found lichen on the northern face, yet no moss grew around the base despite the damp ground. Peter Dobb found the first footprint. It lay in the mud near the entrance and had been made by a leather-soled boot roughly the size of a man's. The track led out of the structure, continued for 5 steps, and vanished on dry leaves. There were no prints leading in. Vane compared the soles of all 7 men's boots. Eli Rusk's was the closest match, though the heel in the track had a missing corner that Eli's boot did not. Eli studied the print for a long time. According to Mercer, he did not look frightened. He looked like a man trying to remember something he had done. Thomas Keel entered first with Vane and Amos Bell. The chamber measured about 12 feet long and 6 feet at its widest point. Its packed earth floor lay below the surrounding ground. Square niches had been cut into both walls. Most were empty, but one held 7 small wooden slats, each carved with a group of symbols. Another contained a thin, tarnished metal plate with a dull, reflective surface. When Amos wiped away the dust, the plate did not show his face. It reflected only the wall behind him, even though his head was directly in front of it. He changed his angle several times. The effect remained. Vane suggested that curvature or oxidation might be causing the illusion. Keel omitted the incident from the official journal but sketched the plate in his private notebook. His drawing showed 7 shadowed figures standing at the entrance, although only 3 men were inside and the other 4 remained outdoors. At the far end of the chamber stood an upright stone slab drilled with many small holes. They were not random, they formed 3 groups of 7. When Keel brought the lamp close, no light passed through. The holes were only a few inches deep. Beneath the slab was a shallow recess containing gray powder. Amos collected a small amount on paper. The material was fine, heavier than ash, and clung to the skin. He suspected a ground mineral. Vane ordered the men out before dark. They made camp more than half a mile away on dry ground with a wide view. But when Keel checked the equipment chest, he found that the 4th journal was gone. The lock was still intact. The book was discovered inside the stone niche that held the 7 wooden slats, the same place they had just left. No one admitted carrying it inside. They returned as a group. The journal lay open to a page none of them had examined. It contained a diagram of the structure, the positions of the niches, and the upright slab at the rear. 7 small figures stood outside. 2 had horizontal lines drawn through them. Along the margin was a sequence of marks Keel described as more like writing than any of the earlier symbols. Vane closed the book, tied it shut, and placed it in Peter Dobb's personal bag. According to the official account, no one left camp that night. Yet the next morning, the boots of Nathan and Eli were coated with gray powder identical to the material in the stone recess. On the right wrist of each man was a faint mark made of 3 dots. Both said they did not know how it had appeared. Vane checked the other members of the party and found no similar marks. From that point forward, the behavior of the Rusk cousins began to change. The change was not obvious enough to be called illness. They continued to eat, work, and carry supplies as before. But the 2 men would sometimes stop at exactly the same moment, look in the same direction, and resume walking a few seconds later without explanation. During discussions of the route, Nathan and Eli no longer participated, yet they always began packing before a decision was announced, as though they already knew which direction the party would take. Over the next 2 days, they led the group through dense timber without searching for a path. Every route eventually rejoined the stone road. Mercer later wrote that their usefulness caused the others to tolerate the abnormal behavior far longer than they should have. If the men had become violent or unable to work, Vane would have been forced to act. Instead, they became more precise, calmer, and less in need of rest. A party lost in the mountains found it difficult to reject 2 men who seemed to know the way. On the 21st day, Nathan led them to an oval clearing. 7 wooden posts, each shoulder high, stood near its center. They were made of the same material as the stakes beside the road. A metal ring was fixed to the top of every post. Although the posts followed a curve, all 7 rings faced the stone structure. Keel measured the distances and found that the posts corresponded almost exactly to the positions of the 7 human figures in the 4th journal. Vane asked Nathan whether he had been there before. Nathan answered that he could not remember, but his feet remembered the road. The sentence appears in both Mercer's journal and Field Book No. 1. Nathan later denied saying it. He insisted he had only guessed the direction from the shape of the terrain. Whatever the truth, the remark became one of the most frequently quoted lines in the Alder Run file. At the clearing's edge, they found the remains of an old camp, 3 black stones arranged side by side, a rotted scrap of oilcloth, and part of the wooden handle from a surveying tool. The initials SV had been carved into it, the initials of Samuel Vane. Vane insisted the piece was not his. Every tool he had brought was still accounted for. The handle was of a recently manufactured style and could not have lain in the soil for many years. Yet the wood had darkened and the remaining metal was corroded as though it had aged for decades. Vane kept it as evidence. After the expedition, examination showed that the broken handle fit precisely onto the head of the survey hammer Vane had been using. Not merely a hammer of the same type, but that exact hammer. The grain and fractures of the broken wood continued into the section still fixed inside the socket. The journals contain no record of the hammer breaking during the journey. When the party returned, it was intact. The weathered fragment therefore appeared to be a missing part of an object that had never been damaged. Samuel Vane later said this discovery was the point at which he should have ordered an immediate retreat. He did not, partly because they still had no reliable route out, partly because Nathan and Eli insisted that a southern path led beyond the basin, and partly, as Vane admitted in private notes, because he had begun to believe they were facing a phenomenon whose value extended far beyond the expedition's original purpose. It was professional curiosity, but not only that. He felt the remains around them formed a system. The markers, the stone road, the water, the structures, the wooden posts, and the journal were connected. If he measured them accurately enough, he believed he could understand that system. The impulse is familiar to people who work in science and surveying. Once a pattern begins to emerge, turning away before it is understood can become more difficult than continuing, even when every practical sign argues for leaving. For the next 4 days, the party did something later observers found difficult to understand. Instead of devoting all their effort to escape, they surveyed the basin. From their perspective, however, surveying was also the best way to locate an exit. Vane divided the area into sections. Keel mapped it, Mercer recorded water and vegetation, and Amos Bell examined the stone. The Rusk cousins guided the work, while Peter Dobb managed the camp and provisions. The initial results seemed useful. The basin was roughly 4 miles long and nearly 3 miles wide, enclosed by 3 mountain ranges. At least 4 branches of the stone road extended outward from the center, but each vanished before reaching a slope. The stream had no consistent direction of flow. 3 small stone structures occupied points that formed an almost perfect triangle. The clearing with the 7 posts lay near the triangle's center. Keel placed everything on his map. When he laid it over a page in the 4th journal, the 2 images nearly matched. The difference was that the journal showed a 4th line passing through the eastern ridge and ending at a small circle. No one could see a path there. Nathan Rusk said the road existed but had not opened yet. When Vane asked what "not opened" meant, Nathan did not answer directly. He pointed toward the sun and said they had to wait until the shadows of all 3 ridges touched the floor of the basin at the same time. In late summer, that would happen as the days grew shorter. Mercer estimated they had less than 2 weeks. Vane had no intention of waiting. He ordered the men to search for a southern exit, where the gap between 2 ridges appeared lowest. They set out the next morning. Nathan and Eli walked in front, but no longer took initiative as they had before. At places where no visible trail divided, the 2 men would stop and wait for Vane to choose before continuing. By noon, the party reached a steep rock slope. According to the map, the southern gap lay beyond it. They climbed for almost 3 hours. When they reached the top, the country before them was not the outside valley. It was the same basin, seen from another direction. Vane assumed they had followed a curved ridge. Keel studied his drawing and could find no way their route should have returned them to that position. They marked an oak with 2 axe cuts, retraced their path, and chose another branch. Late that afternoon, they came upon the same oak again. This time the cuts were on the opposite side of the trunk and had darkened as though made years earlier. Peter Dobb wanted to return to camp. Vane agreed. They followed Nathan through the woods and reached the clearing with the 7 posts before dark, even though the distance they had traveled should have left camp at least 6 miles away. No one said that this was impossible. They checked the supplies, made a fire, and avoided looking at the map for too long. That night, Mercer woke and found Eli Rusk sitting beside the 4th journal. Eli was not writing. He had one hand resting on the open page. The page showed a map of the basin with a new curved line. Mercer called Vane. By the time the others arrived, Eli had taken his hand away, but the new line remained. It led from camp to a point in the north that no one had surveyed. From then on, Vane kept the journal with him. He tied cord around the cover, placed it in a leather satchel, and slept with the bag beneath his head. The next morning, the cord was still secure, but the journal had opened to a different page. Along the margin appeared a sequence of familiar decimal numbers, 75257. No one understood the meaning. Keel suggested they represented men, 7 in the party, 2 crossed out, and 5 remaining. Vane rejected the idea because no one had yet disappeared. After the expedition, however, Keel's interpretation became the most common one. The sequence appeared more than once. It repeated across the next 3 pages between groups of symbols. Later scholars observed that the placement might suggest an order: the total number, the number returning, the number remaining behind, the number carrying the marks, and the total recorded at the final point. There is no firm evidence for that reading, yet because the numbers 7, 5, and 2 appeared before the 2 men vanished, the possibility that the journal was recording future events was never completely dismissed. On the 26th day, the party followed the new line on the map. Vane did not trust the journal, but north was also a reasonable choice because a low saddle lay between 2 ridges. The route brought them into thinner woods and onto a strip of ground covered with gray gravel. No large trees grew within several hundred paces. At the center stood a low circular structure formed by 7 stone slabs leaning inward. A hand-shaped recess had been cut into the inner face of each slab. They were not natural impressions. The cavities had been shaped in different sizes, from small to large. Gray powder covered the 6th and 7th stones. At the base of the 5th lay a metal plate engraved with the name Thomas Keel. Keel recognized it as the brass label from his tool case. When they checked, the original label was still attached. The 2 plates were identical, including a scratch through the letter K. The one found beneath the stone was tarnished and slightly bent, as though it had been lying there for years. This was the second time they had found part of an object still in their possession, but in an older condition. Vane began to regard the basin not merely as a place mapped incorrectly, but as a place where time, or the record of time, did not behave normally. He did not use those words in the official journal. There he wrote that someone might be manufacturing copies in order to deceive the party. In private, however, he asked whether they were seeing objects from another expedition, one that had already happened or would happen along a similar route. Mercer offered a more cautious explanation. Exhaustion, isolation, and fear of being lost, he argued, made the men more likely to perceive connections between similar objects. The brass plate might have belonged to another tool case. The hammer handle might have fit by chance. The symbols might have been made by someone in the party. Directly beneath that reasoning, however, Mercer wrote a sentence he later tried to erase. "I write this to preserve one ordinary way of thinking, not because I believe it." They examined the circular structure. Nothing happened when a man placed his hand into one of the recesses. Nathan and Eli refused to try. Keel set the old brass plate beside the new one, recorded their measurements, and stored them separately. Amos Bell collected a sample of the gray powder. Vane measured the angles of the 7 slabs and found that they did not all point toward the center. Each was offset slightly so that their axes formed a spiral when extended. According to the 4th journal, this structure marked the beginning of the road through the eastern ridge. No doorway or trail was visible, but from the center of the stone ring, a band of darker trees could be seen climbing the slope. Nathan called it the road when there is enough shadow. It was the second of his phrases preserved word for word. Vane refused to wait for that condition. He led the party away from the structure and along the foot of the ridge. They walked for most of a day, but whenever they looked back, the stone ring seemed to remain at the same distance. By afternoon, Keel's measurements showed that they were less than half a mile from where they had started, despite hours of continuous travel. Peter Dobb believed the terrain had misled them into walking in circles. Vane drove 3 stakes into the ground, divided the party into 2 groups, and kept them within sight of one another. An hour later, both groups returned to the same stakes from opposite directions. That evening, Vane announced they would leave the basin by retracing the stone road that had brought them in. It was the first clear decision to retreat. Their provisions could last more than 2 weeks if carefully rationed, but the weather was turning cold. Leaves on the higher slopes were changing rapidly. A thin frost began appearing on the grass at dawn. The entrance road still appeared on Keel's map. They headed west, past the first stone structure, and followed the small cairns beside the stream. After half a day, however, the road ended at the circular stone formation. No one remembered the 2 routes connecting that way. Keel compared his map and found that the road had changed on the paper. A line drawn days earlier now curved north. His separate copy showed the same alteration without any sign of erasure. The entire group might have remembered incorrectly, but Vane had recorded the distance of each segment. The figures did not fit the new route. Keel began to lose control, not loudly, but by checking his handwriting again and again. He wrote the same sentence in 3 places for comparison, asked Mercer whether his hand had changed, and kept his pen in his coat even while sleeping. By then, the Rusk cousins appeared almost unconcerned with escape. They followed orders but showed no anxiety. Nathan said the road was not closed, they were simply standing on the wrong side of it. Eli spent long periods studying the spare survey chain. When Peter Dobb asked why, Eli said the links were counting the spaces, not the distance. The remark caused Vane to inspect the chain. It was still inside the locked chest, but the number of links no longer matched the inventory. A standard survey chain had clearly marked sections. The spare was now 7 links longer. There was no new joint and no mismatched metal. Peter Dobb and Amos Bell counted it 3 times. The result did not change. Vane cut away the final 7 links, wrapped them separately, and recorded the event. The next morning, the chain again contained exactly 7 extra links, while the 7 removed pieces remained in the bag. He did not cut it a second time. From that day forward, the official record became sparse. Field Book Number 1 contained only brief figures and notes on provisions. Curved marks spread across many pages of Number 2. Keel's third book filled with overlapping maps that became almost impossible to separate. Mercer's private journal became the main narrative source, but even he began leaving long periods blank. One gap lasted nearly 2 days. According to the dates, the party left the circular structure on the morning of the 28th day. The next entry was written on the afternoon of the 30th. No one recorded where they had been. Their provisions had declined by exactly 2 days' use. Every man's boots were coated in red mud, a soil not previously seen in the basin. Keel had a small cut across his palm. Nathan and Eli each carried an additional wooden slat carved with symbols. The 4th journal contained 7 new pages. All 5 survivors were later questioned about this missing period. Their answers agreed on only one point: they remembered walking. None could describe the route, a campsite, or the surrounding terrain. Vane remembered a mountainside without trees. Mercer remembered seeing the sky but no sun. Keel remembered drawing a room beneath a stream. Peter Dobb remembered the mules refusing to move, then waking to find one of them gone. Amos Bell remembered an 8th person walking ahead of the party in a coat like Vane's, never turning to show his face. The memories do not fully agree. Yet the 7 new pages in the 4th journal contain a long map showing the group passing through a narrow corridor beneath 3 curved lines. 7 human figures appear at the beginning. There are 8 halfway through. At the end, there are 7 again. The 8th figure has no head, only a line for the body and 2 strokes for legs. After that missing period, the condition of the expedition deteriorated rapidly. One mule disappeared along with part of the provisions. The other injured a leg. The men slept irregularly, confused the time of day, and sometimes believed they had completed tasks that others said had not yet happened. Peter Dobb prepared supper twice in the same afternoon. Amos Bell packed the camp at midnight because he believed dawn had come. Only Nathan and Eli remained clear-headed. They began speaking to one another in short phrases no one else understood. Mercer could not decide whether it was a language or whether they were pronouncing the written symbols aloud, because they stopped whenever anyone paid attention. When ordered to quit, they obeyed, but began again a few hours later. Vane confiscated the 2 carved wooden slats they had carried back after the 2-day gap. The markings matched the 4th journal. One slat contained 7 groups, with the final 2 crossed out. The other showed a curved line and a circle. Vane locked both inside the equipment chest. That night, the chest remained secured, but the slats were found beneath Nathan's and Eli's pillows. By then, Vane no longer believed ordinary discipline could solve the problem. He considered tying the 2 men so they could not leave camp, but Mercer objected because neither had committed any directly dangerous act. Peter Dobb agreed with Mercer. Amos Bell offered no opinion. Keel later said they were all afraid that if they treated the cousins as sick men or enemies, they would lose the only 2 people who seemed able to move through the basin. It is easy to judge that decision from outside, but the other 5 men were exhausted, trapped, and no longer trusted their maps. Nathan and Eli still worked, helped establish camp, and led them to water. Their abnormal behavior was both a threat and their only source of hope. On the 31st day, the shadows of all three mountain ranges touched the floor of the basin at the same time for the first time. Nathan and Eli stood before it happened. They began walking toward the circular structure without taking any equipment. Vane ordered them to stop. They did, but did not turn back. Nathan said the road had opened and that if they missed it, they would have to wait a year. Eli said the journal had recorded all 7 men, but the road would keep only 5. Those are the last words of Eli Rusk that can be established with certainty. Vane decided the entire party would go together, not because he trusted the cousins, but because separating the group had become more dangerous. The men gathered only essential supplies, abandoned the heavier equipment, and reached the stone ring as the basin darkened. The band of shadowed trees on the eastern slope now looked like a distinct opening. From the center of the ring, they could see a narrow trail running straight up the mountain. They followed it. The path was not as steep as the outer slope should have been. Gray gravel covered the ground, and small trees leaned away from it on both sides. After about an hour, the basin disappeared from view, yet the country ahead did not resemble a mountainside. The path entered a corridor between 2 high rock walls and passed beneath a natural arch. Keel wrote that they appeared to be descending even though their legs told them they were climbing. Beyond the arch was a flat, treeless area. 7 long grooves ran across the ground, each wide enough for one person to stand in. Gray powder covered the 2 outer grooves. Ahead stood an unbroken wall of stone with no passage through it. Nathan and Eli stepped into the outermost grooves. Vane pulled Nathan out. Peter Dobb restrained Eli. Neither man resisted strongly, but their bodies were unnaturally cold. Mercer checked their pulses and found them steady. Nathan said they did not need to pass through the wall. The wall would pass through them. Vane ordered an immediate retreat. The party left the flat ground after dark. They followed the same path back, but beyond the stone arch there was no longer a descent into the basin. Instead, a forested slope fell westward, and unfamiliar mountain ranges could be seen in the distance. Vane's compass worked steadily for the first time in days. The needle pointed north. A nearby stream flowed downhill in the ordinary way. They had left the basin. No one knew how. The distance they had walked was not enough to cross the eastern range, yet later calculations placed them on the far side, more than 8 miles from the estimated location of the basin. Vane did not stop to explain it. He ordered a short camp, inspected the supplies, and chose a southeast course, hoping to reach a known tributary. For the first time in weeks, the party shared one clear objective: get out of the mountains before winter. But Nathan and Eli no longer wanted to go with them. During the first day outside the basin, the cousins remained with the group but repeatedly looked back toward the mountains. Nathan walked more slowly, as though listening to instructions that did not belong to the others. Eli reached several times into his coat pocket, where Vane discovered one of the carved wooden slats despite having locked it in the chest. When Vane took it away, Eli did not resist. He said the object no longer needed to be carried because it already knew the road. The terrain outside was easier to understand, but not easy to cross. They were high on a slope covered with loose rock and had to follow water channels down into the valley. The remaining mule refused to cross several open areas and was finally abandoned when its injured leg worsened. Each man carried only essential supplies. Rock samples, many tools, and part of the mapping equipment were left in a marked hollow tree. Vane kept the 4th journal in a leather bag tied across his chest. Keel carried the 3 official books. Mercer kept his plant specimens and private journal. Peter Dobb divided the food. Amos Bell carried the spare compass and the most important samples. Nathan and Eli carried nothing except blankets and their personal knives. On the second morning, Vane found the leather bag open. The journal remained inside, but one page had been torn out. No one found the missing sheet. Nathan and Eli each wore a narrow strip of paper tied around one wrist, covered with symbols like those from the missing page. Vane confiscated the strips, burned them in the fire, and recorded the event. Mercer later remembered that the paper did not catch immediately, but that detail does not appear in the official journal and cannot be verified. By afternoon, they found a stream flowing east. Vane believed that following it would bring them to a tributary marked on the map. It was the first sign that a return might be possible. The Rusk cousins stopped at the bank and refused to cross. Nathan said the water flowed east only for 5 men. When Vane asked where it flowed for the other 2, Nathan answered that they had already gone. The reply exhausted Peter Dobb's patience. He demanded that the men explain themselves or be forced to continue. Nathan stepped into the stream. Eli followed. Both crossed without difficulty. There was no further resistance, but from that moment on, they spoke to no one. That night, the party camped on high ground. Vane assigned two-man watches and made sure Nathan and Eli were never paired together. Nathan stood the first watch with Amos Bell. Eli took the later watch with Peter Dobb. According to Amos, Nathan sat in one place throughout his shift and stared west. When the watch changed, he entered the tent and lay down. Peter Dobb said Eli never left his assigned position either. By morning, both men were gone. Their blankets remained. Their knives lay beside their belongings. Nathan's boots had been placed neatly near the fire, yet the tracks leaving camp showed that he had been wearing boots. Eli's boots were missing. There were no signs of a struggle. A faint line of footprints led toward the stream, but they belonged to only one person. They ended at the bank and did not appear on the other side. Nearby, 7 links of survey chain had been arranged in a curve. Vane inspected the spare chain. Exactly 7 links were missing. Every official account records the disappearance, but the details of the footprints and chain links appear only in Mercer's journal. Peter Dobb later remembered 2 sets of tracks, not one. Amos Bell said he saw no links. Keel said the footprints circled the camp and vanished, rather than leading to the water. Vane refused to describe the exact scene. He confirmed only that the 2 men were no longer there at daybreak. The search began immediately. The 5 remaining men divided into 2 groups but stayed within calling distance. They followed the stream, checked rock crevices, and retraced the route they had traveled. There were no clothes, no blood, no slide marks, and no broken branches. The damp ground should have preserved tracks, yet apart from the faint line near camp, there was nothing. By noon, Keel found a small stone marker less than half a mile away. No one remembered seeing it when they arrived. 7 grooves had been cut into its face, with the 2 outer grooves crossed by horizontal lines. At its base lay a page from the 4th journal. The page showed 5 figures traveling east and 2 turning west. At the end of the western route stood the circular structure. At the end of the eastern route was a square without a door. Vane kept the page and continued the search. They spent the rest of that day and all of the next. On the second night, something suggested the missing men were still nearby. One of Eli's blankets appeared across the stream even though it had remained in camp earlier. Gray powder covered the cloth. There were no tracks around it. On the 3rd day, Amos Bell found Nathan's knife driven into a tree above the height of a man's head. Vane recognized the tree as one they had passed on the 1st day. If the knife had already been there, no one had noticed it. If it appeared later, someone had returned near the camp. They searched the area and found no one. Their food would last less than 10 days. Cold rain had begun. Mercer had developed a mild fever, Keel's injured hand was inflamed, and Peter Dobb was barely sleeping. Vane had to choose between continuing to search for 2 men in a landscape that preserved no trace of them, or leading the remaining 5 out while they still had the strength to travel. He chose to leave on the morning of the 4th day. No one openly objected. The silence surrounding that decision followed all 5 men for the rest of their lives. In later statements, each insisted they had searched as long as conditions reasonably allowed. Yet the way they spoke made clear that the question was never settled. They did not know whether they had abandoned 2 men who were lost, 2 men who had chosen to remain, or 2 men who no longer existed in a form that could be found. Before breaking camp, Keel examined the 4th journal. The 2 crossed-out groups of figures on the earlier pages were no longer marked by simple horizontal strokes. They had been covered completely in gray ink. The 5 remaining figures were connected by a thin line. A map none of them had seen before appeared on the final page. It showed a route east across 3 streams and over a hook-shaped ridge. Vane chose to follow it because it partly agreed with the compass and the terrain before them. This is one of the hardest facts in the account to accept. After the journal appeared to predict the disappearance, the 5 survivors still used it to find their way home. But they had no good alternative. Keel's maps contradicted one another, food was running low, and winter was approaching. The journal, at least, offered a specific route. For the next 6 days, that route proved accurate in a deeply unsettling way. They reached the first stream late on the 1st day, the 2nd the following morning, and the 3rd after crossing a rocky slope. The hook-shaped ridge appeared exactly where the journal placed it. Beyond it lay a long valley running southeast. Each correct landmark brought them closer to safety while increasing the fear that the journal knew where they were and wanted them to follow a path already chosen. Vane occasionally tested another direction for several hundred yards. Every alternative was blocked by fallen timber, cliffs, or deep ravines. Nothing directly threatened them. The terrain simply made one choice easier than all the others. Mercer wrote that the sensation was not like being hunted. It felt as though the expedition was being escorted out after completing some task it did not understand. Whatever presence surrounded them did not seem hostile, but neither did it care whether they had agreed to participate. The spare survey chain continued to change. Each morning it gained or lost links, even though Peter Dobb kept it in his bag. Vane stopped counting after the third day. Keel drew the shapes the chain formed when placed on the ground. They matched lines on the maps in the fourth journal. Later attempts to reconstruct them suggested they resembled contour lines, though they did not describe elevation. They may have represented distance measured by some other quantity. On the fifth night, all 5 men shared a memory they could not determine was dream or waking experience. Each remembered opening his eyes and seeing Nathan and Eli standing at the edge of camp with a stone road behind them. Neither looked injured. Nathan held the fourth journal, though it was still inside Vane's bag. Eli held 7 links of chain. No one remembered what the cousins said. The next morning, the 5 men described nearly identical details without any one of them introducing the subject first. Vane recorded the incident and tore out the page. That torn sheet was later found inside the fourth journal, inserted between 2 pages whose numbers had previously been consecutive. On the back, in Vane's handwriting, was a sentence. "They are not behind us. We are behind them." Vane denied writing it. On the 6th day, they encountered the first sign of human occupation unrelated to the stone system, a rotting fence and the foundation of an abandoned house. Mercer recognized old apple trees. Peter Dobb found a hunting path. By afternoon, they met a trapper from a small settlement almost 50 miles north of Bellwether. According to the maps, the men could not have reached that place by the route they described. If the basin lay where Vane estimated, the distance should have been far greater. They also approached from the east, even though their original journey had taken them west. The trapper led them to the settlement. The 5 remained there for 3 days, eating, resting, and receiving treatment before continuing to Bellwether. Residents described their condition consistently: thin, sleep-deprived, and dressed in torn clothing, but not panicked. What drew attention was their refusal to remain in groups of 7. If 2 residents entered a room containing the 5 expedition members, at least one of the men would leave. At first, this was dismissed as coincidence. After it happened several times, the household arranged matters so that exactly 7 people were never present in one space. The fourth journal remained wrapped and unopened during their stay. Even so, a young girl in the house where Mercer lodged told her mother that the man was keeping a book that wrote while he slept. The mother did not question her further. She repeated the remark only years later, after the case had become known within a limited circle. The 5 men reached Bellwether in early November. News of their return arrived a day before they did. The Rusk family waited in town. Vane said Nathan and Eli had become separated from the party in the mountains and could not be found after several days of searching. In that first explanation, he did not mention the basin, the stone structures, or the fourth journal. Thomas Keel turned over the 3 official field books to the sponsoring group. Vane submitted the maps, rock samples, and instruments. He kept the fourth journal for 2 weeks. The stated reason was that he needed to organize the material and determine the book's origin. Some believed he intended to destroy it. Others thought he spent the time reading its final pages. No one knows what happened during those 2 weeks. When the journal was finally surrendered, it contained 12 pages dated after the expedition had returned to Bellwether. Those pages depicted the 5 survivors in different settings. One figure stood in a room lined with cabinets. One was beside plant specimens. One drew repeating lines on a wall. One sat before a coil of chain. The last faced the mountains. Beneath each figure was a sequence of symbols. The final page showed only 7 grooves, 5 joined together, while 2 extended beyond the edge of the paper. No member of the expedition admitted writing or drawing those pages. The first interviews took place during the winter of 1857. They were not criminal interrogations in the modern sense. 2 men had disappeared in a vast mountain region, and there was no evidence the other 5 had harmed them. The original purpose was simply to prepare a report for the sponsoring institution, notify the families, and decide whether another search should be organized. The statements quickly created problems. On ordinary matters, the 5 men were fairly consistent. They agreed on the departure date, the supplies, the weather during the first week, and the route to the first stone marker. They remembered the loss of the mule, the condition of the food, and the direction of the return journey. But when asked about the basin, their accounts became fragmented. Vane described a valley enclosed on 3 sides and crossed by old stone roads. Mercer remembered water without a direction. Keel focused on the maps and believed the main structure lay underground. Peter Dobbs said he was not certain they had ever entered a basin at all. He remembered only a forest that caused men to walk in circles. Amos Bell admitted seeing stone buildings, but insisted they might have belonged to a vanished settlement. The gaps did not resemble a story rehearsed in advance. If the 5 men had wanted to conceal a crime, they could have invented something simpler. Instead, they admitted details that made their own actions appear questionable. Losing direction, changing journals, the cousins' abnormal behavior, and their decision to use a book of unknown origin to guide them home. The principal interviewer was Charles Harlan, a lawyer and member of the governing board of the college that had helped fund the expedition. Harlan did not believe in supernatural causes. In his notes, he repeatedly explained the events through exhaustion, compass error, poor maps, and group psychology. Yet after questioning each survivor separately, he wrote that none seemed to be telling a fabricated story. They might have been wrong about what they saw, but their fear was genuine. Harlan paid particular attention to one point. When asked what time Nathan and Eli disappeared, each man gave a different answer. When asked where the cousins had last been seen, the answers also varied. But when Harlan asked them to draw the camp and indicate the direction the 2 men had taken, all 5 left the same section of the page blank. None drew the northwestern area, even though each began the sketch from a different point. Harlan asked them to complete the missing section. Vane said he could not remember it. Mercer became nauseated. Keel drew one curved line and tore up the paper. Dobbs stood and left the room. Amos Bell stared at the blank space for nearly a minute and said that a map should not contain that part. A second expedition was proposed, but did not leave immediately. Winter had arrived, the roads were closed, and no one could establish the basin's exact location. In the spring of 1858, a small party of local hunters and 2 surveyors followed Vane's directions. They found the first stone marker and a section of an old road, but no basin. The stone road ended at a fresh landslide. After 3 weeks, they returned. Another search in 1860 used a copy of Keel's map. That group found a stream lined with alder trees, but it flowed west as the terrain required. They found 7 small cairns, but no structure. One participant wrote that on the 10th day, they repeatedly returned to the same oak despite traveling in different directions. The expedition leader omitted that detail from the official report. Nathan and Eli Rusk were never formally declared dead on the basis of any physical evidence. Their family held a memorial service, but Nathan's mother refused to place his name on a gravestone. She said she did not believe the men were dead. When she died years later, her belongings included a carved wooden slat like those taken from the stone structure. No one knew where she had obtained it. The 4th journal was placed in the college archives. At first, it was treated simply as a document of unknown origin. Thomas Keel and 2 professors compared its symbols with the Cherokee syllabary, hunters' trail signs, mining marks, and common forms of cipher. Nothing matched. The symbols did not repeat with the frequency expected of an ordinary alphabet. A given form could change depending on its position while retaining part of its structure, more like a sign expressing a relationship than a sound. In 1861, a bookbinder examined the materials. He discovered that the number of sheets did not match the construction of the binding. The journal consisted of folded gatherings sewn in groups, yet 3 leaves between 2 gatherings were not attached to the thread. They were neither pasted in nor loose and could not be removed without tearing the spine. He opened part of the cover and stopped because the interior structure did not resemble any binding method he recognized. After he reassembled it, the journal contained 2 more pages than it had at the beginning. The incident is often dismissed as a counting error, but the binder recorded the page totals before and after. The 2 new pages appeared within the section describing the return journey. One showed the room where he worked, including the scissors on his table and a crack in the doorframe. The other showed a man bending over the book while 2 tall, narrow, faceless figures stood behind him. The binder refused to continue and would not accept payment. The Civil War began a few years later, ending most attention to the Alder Run file. Virginia was divided, and many records were moved or lost. The college evacuated part of its archive. The journal was packed in a crate with the maps and sent to a building farther east. Shipping records show that the crate weighed 42 pounds when it left and 49 pounds when it arrived, though the seals remained intact. When opened, the spare survey chain was found inside. Vane insisted that he had kept the chain at his home. He checked and found that his own coil was still there. The two chains contained the same number of links and bore identical cut marks near the final 7. No one could determine which was the original. One remained with the archive, the other disappeared from Vane's house in 1864. The later lives of the 5 survivors are incompletely documented, but enough survives to show that each carried a part of Alder Run with him. Samuel Vane continued surveying for nearly another decade. His maps remained accurate, but colleagues noticed that he never filled an area completely. No matter how small the region, he always left an oval blank space in the northwestern corner. When asked, he said a map required room for error. The blank spaces were drawn in the same proportion as the basin on Keel's map. Vane also began collecting reports of stone roads, streams that changed direction, and markers with 7 grooves. Letters came from Kentucky, Tennessee, western North Carolina, and southern West Virginia. Most were vague stories. Some witnesses may have heard about the expedition and interpreted ordinary remains differently because of it, but 3 reports submitted before the case became widely known included drawings closely resembling the 7 grooves, the basin shape, and the 3 dots. In 1868, Vane retired. He lived alone near Staunton and never returned to the Appalachians. After his death, his family found dozens of maps without place names. Each depicted a mountain region enclosed by 3 ranges, with roads spiraling inward and an exit to the east. On the back of the final map was a sentence: "The way out does not return us to where we entered. It only takes us to the place from which we are permitted to continue." The handwriting was confirmed as Vane's. Jonah Mercer returned to botany. For several years, he published valuable observations on mountain plants. The Alder Run specimens, however, could not be used. Leaves lost their color, seeds would not germinate, and wood samples lacked ordinary internal structure. Mercer kept them in a private cabinet. He wrote that their positions sometimes changed while the cabinet remained locked. 7 leaves often arranged themselves in a curve, with 2 separated from the group. Mercer wrote more than anyone else about the psychological effects of the expedition. He did not claim to have witnessed the supernatural. He proposed that the basin might contain minerals that disrupted compasses, water that caused illness, and terrain that produced severe disorientation. But he admitted those explanations could not account for the journal, the aged duplicates of their possessions, or the shared memories of the 5 men. In his later years, Mercer studied animal navigation. He became especially interested in migratory birds and their ability to return. In one note, he asked whether human beings might possess a weaker version of the same mechanism, and whether Alder Run had interfered with it, causing a person to feel that one direction was correct even when it did not lead home. He called the phenomenon the memory of direction. Thomas Keel showed the clearest lasting effects. He continued drawing maps after the expedition, but gradually turned to images with no professional purpose. They showed valleys layered over one another, roads connecting places separated by impossible distances, and rooms that existed only when viewed from a particular angle. Many included 7 human figures, 2 of them outside the frame. Keel insisted he was not inventing anything. He said he was copying places seen during the missing 2 days. Friends believed he had suffered psychological trauma. Yet several of Keel's drawings accurately depicted areas later found by the 1860 search party, even though he did not take part and had not seen its report before making them. In 1872, Keel disappeared from his home. The door was locked from the inside. There was no sign of entry. An unfinished map in Field Book number 3 lay on the table. The map showed his room with a stone road passing through the western wall. 7 chain links rested beside it. Keel's body was never found. Peter Dobb returned to transport work but never again used chains. He replaced them with rope even when chain would have been more practical. He avoided groups of exactly 7 people and refused to sleep near running water. Dobb rarely discussed the expedition. His only later statement was recorded in 1881 when a local reporter found him. Dobb said Nathan and Eli had not been left behind. In his view, the 5 men who returned were the ones who had been left, while the 2 cousins had gone where the road was meant to lead. Amos Bell continued working as an ore assayer. He preserved the gray powder from the stone structure for years. Simple tests showed that it contained iron, graphite, calcium, and an unidentified component. The sample's weight changed from one measurement to another. Bell blamed the scale, though other objects gave stable results. He divided the powder between 2 jars. At times, the combined weight of the jars exceeded that of the original sample. Bell died in 1876. His gravestone bore the symbol of 7 grooves, the basin, and 3 dots. His family said they had not requested it. The stonecutter insisted the design had already been present on the slab before he carved the lettering. This is the gravestone mentioned in later records. When the cemetery was relocated in 1904, the symbol was gone from the front but appeared on the back. The later lives of the 5 men kept the Alder Run story alive within a small circle, but the 4th journal prevented it from disappearing altogether. After the Civil War, several scholars returned to the document. They tried cryptography, mathematics, and comparative cartography. No one could read it, but a gradual consensus emerged that it was not a collection of random marks. Certain relational symbols repeated consistently. One group appeared near depictions of water. Another was associated with roads, entrances, or changes in position. The 2 symbols corresponding to the crossed-out human figures always differed in some way from the others. The sequence 7, 5, 2, 5, 7 appeared on multiple pages. The journal seemed to be describing a process, not merely a journey. In 1893, mathematician Edwin Marr examined the maps and realized that the lines could not coexist on a flat surface if treated as conventional geography. But if every intersection represented a transfer from one surface to another, the system became internally consistent. Marr proposed that the journal did not measure distance in miles. It recorded relationships between locations. 2 places might be close within that system even while far apart on an ordinary map. He used the example of a book. 2 sentences printed on opposite sides of a sheet might be close in meaning, yet could never touch if one traveled only across the surface of the paper. To connect them directly, one would have to move through the structure of the book. According to Marr, the stone roads at Alder Run might have provided a way of traveling through the structure of the landscape rather than across its surface. Many rejected the theory as too abstract and impossible to test. Marr continued privately. 6 months later, he returned the journal with a warning that it should not be opened in page order. He offered no further explanation. In his study, investigators found loose pages arranged in a circle and connected by string so that any one page could lead to several others. Marr died of illness 2 weeks later, with no clear connection to the research. At the beginning of the 20th century, the journal was photographed for the first time. Some plates failed to capture symbols that were plainly visible to the eye. Others revealed lines that did not appear on the physical page. In one photograph of the basin map, a faint 8th figure stood behind the 7 men. The photographer blamed a flaw in the glass plate, but the 8th figure appeared in 3 separate exposures, in a different position each time. In 1923, linguistics professor Harold Wynne spent nearly 2 years classifying the symbols. He could not translate the text, but he determined that the system operated on several levels. There were primary signs, modifying signs, and marks that altered the relationship between elements separated by great distances on the page. Wynne believed a symbol near the beginning might change the meaning of another symbol many pages later. Reading each page in isolation, therefore, would produce no coherent meaning. Wynne also discovered that the recorded page count changed over time. The 1861 catalog listed 214 pages. An 1890 inventory listed 218. In 1923, Wynne counted 221. There was no evidence that new leaves had been sewn in. He numbered the corners in pencil. 1 month later, an unnumbered page appeared between 140 and 141. It showed a man seated at a desk with 7 groups of classification cards. Wynne was working in precisely that manner. He ended the study immediately. In his final report, Wynne did not claim that the journal predicted the future. He wrote only that the document appeared to record the observer as part of its contents. The wording was cautious, but it strongly influenced how the file was handled afterward. Researchers were no longer permitted to work alone, and their exposure time was limited. During the second half of the 20th century, the Alder Run material received little attention. The journal remained in a sealed archival box and was opened only for restricted study. Changes in the page count were no longer reported regularly, perhaps because inventory procedures had improved, or perhaps because no one wished to record what could not be explained. A memorandum from 1967, however, states that the survey chain stored beside the journal arranged itself into 3 interlocking loops inside a locked cabinet. A conservator dismantled the pattern, photographed the chain, and laid it straight. The next morning, the loops had formed again. In 1984, a geography team used aerial photography and topographic maps to search for a basin enclosed by 3 ridges. They identified 4 possible locations in southern West Virginia and southwestern Virginia. 3 were examined and showed nothing unusual. The 4th lay in privately owned forest and was difficult to reach. Aerial images showed an oval clearing and a straight line cutting through the trees. When the team arrived a year later, the clearing was gone. The trees standing there were far older than the date of the photograph. One member carried a copy of the journal's basin map. During the trip, he marked their position in red ink. After returning, the red mark was not where he remembered placing it. It had moved to the eastern edge, near the circular symbol. He assumed the paper had been switched. The archive confirmed that the copy had never left his possession. By the beginning of the 21st century, digital imaging allowed closer comparison. Multispectral scans showed that some ink lines appeared within the paper rather than on its surface, in a manner unlike ordinary absorption. The marks seemed to exist between individual fibers. Other lines lay on the surface but did not react like common historical inks. No result established that the materials were unnatural or beyond the technology of the period. The findings simply did not fit a single method of manufacture. Geometric analysis strengthened the idea that the maps did not represent a flat space. In computer models, some routes could connect only if the surface folded in on itself, or if the beginning and ending points were treated as the same location in 2 different states. This did not prove that the roads at Alder Run distorted space. It showed only that whoever made the journal was using a system ordinary maps could not adequately express. The most notable event occurred during a digitization project in 2009. Researchers photographed every page, numbered the images, and stored them on a computer disconnected from any network. The total was 223 pages. When the folder was checked the following day, it contained 225 images. The 2 new files did not share the same time data as the rest. One showed a page with a diagram of the digitization room. The other depicted 5 people standing around a table, while 2 figures stood behind the wall. The physical journal was examined. It still contained 223 pages. The 2 images matched no physical sheet. They were copied to another device for analysis, but after the transfer, the original files became images of blank pages. The copies retained detail for several hours and then faded as well. Only a paper print preserved part of the images. That print is now stored separately and is not kept beside the journal. There is no public evidence that similar events continued after 2009. Modern archivists are more cautious than earlier researchers. They do not describe the document as dangerous, and they do not claim that it possesses awareness. The official explanation remains a combination of inventory errors, unreliable memory, deteriorating materials, and the human tendency to discover patterns in ambiguous information. That explanation is reasonable. It may even be correct. Perhaps Vane's party simply became lost in terrain that was difficult to survey. Perhaps Nathan and Eli suffered from starvation, exhaustion, or contaminated water. Perhaps they walked away from camp and died in a ravine that was never searched. Perhaps the 4th journal belonged to an earlier expedition, and Thomas Keel unconsciously added to it under extreme stress. The new pages may have been counting errors. The aged objects may only have resembled the tools still in the men's possession. The chain may have been misremembered. Later reports may have been shaped by the story that already existed. But that explanation leaves questions behind. Why did the journal depict the basin before the men finished surveying it? Why were 2 figures crossed out before Nathan and Eli disappeared? Why did all 5 survivors share the same gaps in memory while disagreeing about so many other details? Why did the routes in the journal lead them out more accurately than the maps they had made themselves? And why did a document of unknown origin continue to record rooms, instruments, and researchers decades after the expedition had ended? In 1857, 7 men left Bellwether to measure what had not yet been measured. They believed terrain could be transferred to paper, distance could be divided into chain links, and unknown land could be made understandable through careful observation. 5 returned with evidence that measurement does not always make a place more familiar. Sometimes it reveals only how small a human map truly is. Nathan and Eli Rusk were never found. There is no confirmed grave, no final possession, and no direct account of the moment they left the world shared by the other 5 men. They remain only in the lines cut across stone, in 2 figures outside the frame, and in pages no one remembers writing. The 4th journal still exists. Its gray leather cover has dried further, its paper has become brittle, and some of the symbols have faded. But the most recent catalogs do not publish a final page count. According to one person who once worked in the archive, the reason is not that the number is secret. The archivists no longer wish to confirm a number that may be different the next time someone checks. Alder Run does not appear on modern maps. There are many streams with similar names, many valleys lined with alder trees, and many old stone roads buried beneath forest growth. None has been confirmed as the place Vane's party entered. Those who search for the basin usually return by ordinary routes and report nothing beyond stone, trees, and water. Perhaps the location was misidentified from the beginning. Perhaps it was only a combination of several places joined together in damaged memory. Or perhaps a place recorded by the kind of map contained in the journal cannot be found by following ordinary coordinates. The Appalachian Mountains still contain regions where signals fail, trails disappear quickly, and fog can make a familiar valley look entirely different. None of that requires a supernatural explanation. But somewhere between southern West Virginia and southwestern Virginia, there may still be a stone marker bearing 7 grooves, a road that does not return travelers to the place where they entered, and a basin that opens its passage only when the shadows of 3 ridges touch the ground at once. If 2 new human figures someday appear in the journal, would it mean that Nathan and Eli had finally returned, or only that another expedition had begun to follow their road? And if you found that journal in an old archive, would you open to the final page to see how many figures were waiting there?